Ladies and gentlemen, can I present to you Jennifer Wadella? Yay!
Thanks. How's everyone doing? I'm still a little upset about the lack of bad programmer dad jokes. That was seriously my favorite segment last year. Just like straight up reading jokes, and I just laughed like a moron in like the third row. Everybody have a good conference so far? Yeah, all right, there's the energy. I know you're like, oh, it's cocktail time, almost. We're so close, we're gonna get there. Okay, but we're going to be talking about a couple different things over the next couple minutes, including why we became afraid to try. So a little bit about me, if you haven't realized, I'm not from around here, I'm from America. My name is Jennifer Wadella. You can follow me on Twitter at @OMGIt'sFetty. It is the time of year that I warn people that if you're looking for tech content, don't follow me because I will be drunk tweeting The Bachelor on Monday nights, because that's what I do. For my day job, I'm the lead Angular consultant at a company called Batovi. We tend to focus on JavaScript, and Angular is my happy place. I'm a community organizer, and I'm also what I call a fermentista. I love experimenting with code, I love experimenting with a lot of different things, and I really love experimenting with kombucha. So if you look in the lower left-hand corner, that's what you're seeing there. And when we talk about experimenting, that's kind of everything that trying is all about, right? We try different things, that's how we come up with new ideas, that's how we come up with new concepts. I mean, everything that we have in this room, everything that we have around us came from some sort of trial and error, some sort of experimentation. And somehow along the lines, we've become really scared to experiment. We've become scared to try. And I really don't understand what's going on with that. Has anybody had kombucha before? Couple hands in the audience. All right, so it'll be a little crash course for those of you who haven't. If you've never heard of it, it is a fermented tea drink that is made by adding yeast and bacteria to tea and sugar, and a lot of times you'll have additional flavorings, be it fruit juice or spices or something like that. Because of the fermentation process and the bacteria, it's full of probiotics, which are really good for gut health. It's also fizzy, which is why I like to drink it. Sometimes you just want something with a bit of that mouthfeel, and if you're trying to get away from pop or soda or drinking too much bourbon like I do, kombucha can be a really good health choice. We don't know a lot about its history. Estimated origins are around 200 BC, but it's been around for a while, meaning we as humans have been experimenting and doing weird shit with mold and yeast for a long time now. Anyway, I'm a huge kombucha fan, really, really like it a lot. There's just one really big problem. It's a little bit pricey. So it wouldn't surprise me if you're spending, 3 or 4 pounds on it here, which is a little more than I would like to be spending for a drink that I might drink 2 to 3 times a day, especially when it can be so cheap to brew it at home. We've got a couple basic ingredients here. We've got our SCOBY, which is a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, water, tea, sugar, and whatever flavorings we might like. I tend to use raspberry. I get really good results with that. I also really like doing a red bell pepper booch. Sometimes I'll do like a carrot and turmeric, and what else do I put in there? Ginger and a little bit of black pepper because it helps the turmeric absorption, but all sorts of different things you can do. So really basic, pretty cheap ingredients here. And I do want to call out a misnomer if anybody is familiar with kombucha brewing. That gross looking floaty thing there is not actually the SCOBY. The entire liquid, the entire thing is the SCOBY. That is just the pellicle, which is kind of a byproduct of the fermentation process. So you can like go up to all your kombucha friends and be like, oh, did you know that's not really the SCOBY? And they'll be like, whoa, mind blown. I spend a little bit too much time in the kombucha brewing subreddit if you haven't noticed yet. Okay, so when I started brewing kombucha, of course, I'm a research nerd, and so I go and I buy the big book of kombucha, and I do all my research online, and I research vessels and fermentation processes, and then I start brewing. I'm like that weird person who, I have this thing for like beverage dispenser jars that are like really cool and really weird shapes, so I always have like way too many around my house. They come in handy for like once a year when I have a birthday party and I do different drinks, or when I decide to start brewing kombucha. So it was really easy for me to take that vessel that I had and use that to start brewing in. So when we look at our process of what it takes to brew kombucha that was discovered by this experimentation however many years ago, we start very basic. We brew up some tea. Y'all should be pretty good at that by now in this country. Yeah. Okay, and once we do that, we're going to add sugar to it. The SCOBY is going to need something to feed off of, and so that sugar in the tea is what it's going to look for to eat. And so what you want to do is you want to let that cool down. Our SCOBYs do not like very high temperatures. We want to make sure to let our sweet tea cool down to about room temperature, and then you're going to be ready to go. Because I am an experimenter and because I'm lazy as fuck, I discovered it's easier to make like a really strong batch of hot tea and then add cold water to it, and then I get to wait even less time. It's really amazing, really speeds up my process. So that's a little experimenting I do. And so once you've added your tea to your SCOBY, you just let the SCOBY sit there and do its magic. It's going to go through its fermentation process. And the cool thing is this is a fairly safe hobby. Beer brewing can get a little sketch if you've tried that before, but there's not a lot that can go wrong with kombucha brewing. There's not really like that many issues you can deal with. You can deal with mold, but most of the time the environment that you're dealing with is so acidic and so vinegary that it's not really going to be problematic. So that means you can taste your brew at any time to see how it's doing. The worst that's going to happen is you're going to, like, it's going to be way too sweet and you're just going to be like, oh God, I just gave myself diabetes, or it'll have gotten too vinegary, and then you can kind of tweak the mixture. So once the the brew is at a point that you like the taste, then it's time to bottle it. And so you'll pour it into some sort of container that you have around and add whatever flavors you want. Again, as I mentioned, I'm a really big fan of my red bell pepper flavoring, but I like experimenting with different spices. I did a pineapple serrano pepper one time, and I took it over because I was working on a talk with one of my girlfriends, and her partner walked in the kitchen and took a big swig of it before realizing what he was drinking, and that was an adventure to see him like almost spray like jalapeno kombucha, or excuse me, serrano kombucha out his nose. But anyway, so you choose your flavors and you let it sit. For me, I have learned in my experimentation, in my many trials, that it works really well if I let my flavored bottles sit for about 2 days. That's going to get the flavor out. It's going to basically create more fizz from eating whatever sugars are available in the fruit or whatever I put in there. So at that 2-day mark, I go ahead and I strain all the fruit out and I rebottle. And then I let it sit for another 7 days. That gets the fizziness to a point that I like. One of the things I discovered in my trial and experimentation is if I let it sit in with fruit for too long, I would end up with explosions. I remember I was trying this new like pumpkin spice brew because I'm a basic bitch from America, and I had left it for about 5 days, and I have this like big plastic container, and I keep all my bottles in there because I don't want anything to explode and go all over my dining room, because we've made that mistake before. So I like open the box and I like carefully like flip the lid to see the fermentation, and I just spray it everywhere. There's pumpkin spice all over the room. The cat is covered in pumpkin spice, and she's just like, really, bitch, really? So that is when I started doing a little bit of research and implemented my 2-day rule for flavoring and then straining and rebottling and let it sit and get to that point. So that's a little bit about what it's like to make kombucha the way I do it. I do it as a continuous brew process, which means I have this big gallon setup, a liters here, yeah, milliliters? I don't know. Anyway, I'm bad at your conversions, but so I've got this big brew set up, and what I do is I continuously strain off that to fill my bottles, and then I'll add more sweet tea mixture to it, and so it's always this really kind of hit and miss process of adding and tweaking and seeing what works and seeing what does. So my process might cost something like this. If you didn't have a fermentation vessel, you might spend, 24 pounds. I really like these flip bottles that have kind of the grolsch. I don't even know how to pronounce that word, but the ones that you flip and they use the kind of springiness on the tops. So maybe if you were to buy a couple of those to do your bottling, and then tea, sugar, and whatever fruit you might want. So this is not a very expensive hobby. Pretty reasonable. And so that was very much the approach I took, is like, oh, I can spend way less money on kombucha, I can brew my own, it'll be this fun activity. And this is a little bit what my first brew went like. Yeah, it was delicious, it was great fizz, but I lost like half my booch down the sink. And so again, like, this is a really fun thing to try and experiment and play with. A lot of times I'll go to the kombucha brewing subreddit and I want to get inspiration or ideas, or I just want to show off like whatever pretty carbonation I've created, because you got to humble brag. But the thing that happens in this subreddit is I stumble across a lot of questions like this. So this user is asking about how full their bottles should be that they fill. So they're straining off their main brew and trying to figure out. And I'm kind of looking at this question and I'm like, they're clearly very concerned about this. Why do they not just try different things? Like, we just looked at our costs, right? It's not that expensive. Like, if we brew like this bottle of kombucha, maybe that is like, I don't know, half a dollar, like not a lot of money going on. And so these people are so terrified to even like try and figure out stuff on their own. Why are they so scared to try different things? Or this one, with dried herbs, is it best to crush them or add whole? Again, something that seems really, really simple, but they're scared to just try it or experiment on their own. One of the things that I learned really quickly was I tried to be lazy, and I was like, oh, you know what? I'm going to use fruit juice, so I don't even have to deal with straining it out. And I did that for one of my first batches, and I got almost no carbonation, no fizziness out of it. And so the next time, I used whole fruit instead, and I got that fizziness that I was looking for. Again, not a very expensive experiment, but that's something that I felt comfortable trying and figuring out. So why are people so scared of doing these experiments, to trying these different things? Here's another one. Can I take my booch out? I should let you in on a little secret that we call kombucha booch. It's like the thing that cool kids do, and now you're all cool kids because you know about that. So, can I take my booch back out of the fridge to let it carbonate further? I don't know, why don't you try it? Like, nothing's gonna happen. The worst you're gonna get is some sort of explosion where you cover your cat in pumpkin spice kombucha, and then they're grumpy at you for a little bit. But again, it's just like, there's not a lot of scary things that can happen here. And I wonder all the time, why are people so afraid to try things? And this is something that we should be really, really concerned about in our industry, because we are trying things all the time. We are building new technologies. We are building new frameworks. And if we are living in a society that is constantly afraid to try things, how is that stifling our innovation? How is that stifling everything that we can accomplish? And I mean, it's crazy to think about, because we learned about the scientific method in school, right? We learned the importance of doing experiments and asking a question and doing research, creating a hypothesis, doing an experiment, taking a look at your data, and figuring out a way to communicate the results. So like, somehow we have lost this idea that experimentation and trial is okay, going from childhood when we learned about this in science class to where we are today. You know, we talk about variable considerations with our experiments, understanding the difference between controlled variables, independent, and dependent variables. For instance, with kombucha brewing, you want to kind of eliminate as many, you want to get as many controlled variables as you can. So things you're going to care about are the ratio of sugar in your tea to make sure that it's the proper amount. You're going to care about heat. That very much affects the way the yeast acts inside the SCOBY. So the more you're aware of these different variables, the better your trials and the better your experiments will turn out. I'm super obsessed with this place. I haven't gotten to go here yet, but this is the Noma Restaurant, and they actually have an experiment kitchen in Copenhagen. And all they do is try shit. And they try really weird shit. Like, they are fermenting things that should probably not be fermented. And they are turning them into delicious dishes. And this is like that place that you have to basically kill somebody to get a reservation at. Like, their success is built on their experimentation and test kitchen. I actually got this book, The Noma Guide to Fermentation, because I'm like that nerd that like sits and reads a fermentation book at night in bed. But it's really, really cool, and they talk about their process, and not only do they talk about their test kitchen, which they have an entire staff just to try stuff, but then they've written this book that talks about their experiments and the process we've gone through. And again, it's kind of weird to think about, because if we're thinking about the fact that we've been brewing kombucha since around 200 BCE, we're still trying and experimenting all the time. And you're like, it's 2020, why are we still experimenting? Why do we still have VGA? I don't know, it's crazy. But anyway, like, there's so much experimentation that goes on. Earlier this year, I went on a distillery trip to a place called Reinhold in Chicago with my partner. And it was really interesting. They are a brandy distillery. It's a dad and daughter that had this idea. And we did the tour, and it was really cool. The brandy they were making was amazing. They had these really great mixed cocktails. But it was so interesting to hear them talk about their fermentation process and how much experimenting they did. And so you think about that in the context of this is a business that needs to make money to survive, and a huge part of their business model is just trying shit and trying to deal with different things. Like they were telling us a story of they wanted to do a brandy with mango, and they got it shipped in, and the containers were all messed up, and they ended up like with mango sludge just all over their facility and spent days cleaning all the guck up. And it's just bizarre to me that we can be this far in civilization and still figuring out how to brew and ferment alcohol and spend that much time and effort into it. And you're like, Jennifer, like, I don't give a shit. Why are you babbling at me about fermentation? Like, who cares? I don't care. Why does it matter if people are afraid? Why does it matter if people aren't trying? And the thing is, fear of trying keeps people out of the tech industry, and it halts innovation. And this fear of trying is going to affect diversities and minorities way more than anybody else, because we have so much more to risk when it comes to failure. Because if I fail on stage, if I fail at writing code, it's not I'm failing at code, it's women are failing at code. Women are failing on stage. And women and minorities have this fear. So not only do they have to worry about their expertise and being good enough, but they don't want to be a bad reflection on the rest of us who already don't feel welcome in this industry. So this fear of trying, we need to be really aware of and understand it's keeping certain people out. And then a step further, those people that it's keeping out are the people who are going to innovate products and think about things and new approaches and new ideas that the people already in the industry won't think about. I see this all the time. I run a nonprofit, Kansas City Women in Technology, where we are teaching women how to code. And we do a lot of things, but one of the biggest things we do is we create an environment for them. Because it's not about the code. It's about creating an environment that they feel safe to try in, they feel safe to fail in. And you know, we have to onboard them and we have to tell them, yes, it's exciting when you get in a new error. Like that is our form of excitement as engineers a lot of the time. New error, okay, we can progress now. But that to them registers as failure. That registers to them as something they did wrong. And they don't want to be wrong, and they don't want other people to know they're wrong. And we need to be aware of that. So how do we keep fear from taking over? This is the biggest thing that we can think about. I know this also applies, I feel like I see this a lot with new technical architects, where they get just like really afraid of taking on their first project, or figuring out how to architect something, or taking on a new feature, or beginning to scope out and ask questions, get requirements. They just get frozen and paranoid, and they don't know where to start, and they're just terrified of failing. So a couple things. We can ask and try and figure out why we are afraid. What's going on? Is your lack of knowledge the problem in this situation? Are you afraid of being judged? And I feel like as developers and engineers, we pride ourselves on our intelligence, right? It's our mark in the world. Especially if you were that kid that was like a little socially awkward and nerdy and smart and grow up getting bullied for it, your intelligence was that thing that like was your hold on your self-pride and your self-worth. And so as engineers, we're terrified to admit that we don't know something. And we don't want other people to realize we don't know something. And so having an understanding of why we are afraid is a big part of understanding that. So one of the things we can do once we've kind of figured out why we're afraid is to find ways to ground ourselves. Think about the problem at hand. What is the worst case scenario that could go wrong there? And then work back, because that worst case scenario isn't likely. But if you've planned for it, that's a little less fear that you have. That's a little more fear that you can chip away at and be more willing to try, because you understand that, oh, well, if I try this and it doesn't completely work out, this is the worst that can happen. If I take my kombucha out of my fridge, it just stays flat. Or maybe it fizzes and goes all over my cat. Those are my worst case scenarios, right? So I should be able to evaluate that and say, hey, okay, I'm gonna go ahead and try that. You can also do a cost-benefit analysis. So that's kind of why I was harping a lot on the numbers of kombucha brewing earlier, is if we use that as an example for our cost-benefit analysis. Oh, I'm scared to try something. I'm scared to try brewing kombucha. Even if you're not a weird nerd that like collects different drink vessels and all sorts of stuff and you had to buy some supplies, that was about like 41 pounds. And we're developers, we're software engineers, we make decent salaries, so you know what, if you spent 41 pounds, for a experiment that bombed, it's not the end of the day, and you would have learned something and gotten something cool out of it. And you know what, sometimes we forget, us writing code is pretty damn cheap. Maybe not for other people who are hiring us as engineers, but if we want to try something, if we want to prototype something, we can do that. Like, it might take a couple hours out of our day. We can at least put our fingers to the keyboard and make magic happen. And it's pretty cheap if you think about it. Except, of course, if you're doing AWS, in case I do not say try anything and lose your company thousands or millions of dollars, that is not the best place to try. But the point is, you can use these to help you get over your fear of starting. Whatever that project is, whatever that thing that you're working on is, figure out ways to understand what's going on. And we're gonna get a little bit into physics here. Anybody familiar with Newton's laws? Yeah, okay. So first law, every object is in a state of uniform motion that will remain in that state of motion unless an external force acts on it. And so this is why when you're first trying to move something, because it is at a state of non-movement, it's harder to get moving. But once it gets moving, it's going to keep going unless something acts on it. Of course, yes, we have friction and everything like that, but when you're up against that big new problem that you want to solve, and you're kind of freaking out, right? You're like, oh, I don't know, like what if I do it this way, or what if I do it this way, and what's the cost of this, or what's the cost of this? Just get it started. Just get that ball rolling, and everything's going to be a lot easier after this. And this is something I still struggle with all the time. Like I'll get on a new project or be on a new client, and it'll kind of be that paralysis of, ooh, but what if I do it this way? Or, oh, well, we haven't refined all the business requirements that way. What if I end up shooting myself in the foot? And every time, like after kind of evaluating what's going on and just getting things started, it moves a lot faster and it gets a little less scary. Just take that first step and you'll get going. Because code is also malleable. We like to think that every line of code we rewrite is going to be perfect and it'll last through time, but that is not the way the world works. That is not the way requirements work. That is not the way that pissy CEOs that have one mood on Monday and then have another mood on Wednesday work. So it's okay that we're going to write code that may change. So don't be afraid of writing a line of code that may not be perfect. That's how you're going to learn, that's how you're going to grow, and that's how we're going to learn to ask better questions, to understand our users, understand the business needs, understand the products that we're trying to build, and write better code for that. We also need to understand that society has really set us up to feel failure. Failure is not praised at all. It is not the things we see. We don't see glamorous shows about failure or anything like that. And it starts with our education system. And when we think about test taking, for instance, like that's a very black and white scenario. Oh, this is right or this is wrong. You don't get praised for the energy or the effort trying to get there. And a big part of understanding how we can be better in our school system and avoiding this mindset is understanding the idea of intelligence and whether somebody's perspective is whether they have a fixed or a growth mindset. So if you're unfamiliar with this concept, there are people that believe that their intelligence is fixed. They have a jar this big, it's this full of intelligence, and it'll never get any fuller. Because they don't believe that's something that can be improved. They have that much smart, and that's how much they have to operate with. And this is something that I very much operated at when I was younger. I was a very bright kid, so I got stuff right away. And I was praised for being intelligent. And I never had to work, and I never had to try. And then the second that I got to university and I had to try for the first time, I was bawling my eyes out because I was too stupid to be in college. And so I had this idea that intelligence was fixed, and I had to work really, really hard to reshape that internal idea that I had and realize that intelligence can be improved. You can learn things, you can grow. And so it's important to have a growth mindset. I'll have a link to these slides after, but there's this really interesting study that was done where they wanted to look at parents and the way children observe their parents and figure out if a parent had a growth mindset, essentially, if the child would adapt that mindset. And one of the things they realized was what really matters is the way the parents reacted to failure. That's really what shaped the children's intelligence mindset. So the parents that were very harsh about failure or very outspoken about things being a failure, those kids tended to think that intelligence was fixed and not adaptable, not growable. So these are things that we can consider when we are teaching the next generation of programmers, how we're talking to them, how we're getting them to understand the concept of intelligence, and making sure they're aware of that. We can adopt growth mindsets for ourselves, especially after a conference like this, where you're learning a bunch of new things and maybe feeling down about yourself because you don't have enough time to work on all the new things you want. You can consider that you have the ability to learn and grow. I really love this tweet. I mean, there's a pretty snarky one if you go and look up the thread afterwards because this account is snarky, but I love this. The concept you're currently struggling to learn, stick with it because it's all going to make sense very soon. And I'm sure you can think back on your programmer journey and remember those very significant moments where you're really, really struggling with a concept. And then one day it just clicked. and you never had to struggle with it again. So remember, you can get there, and you can get there, and you can get there. There's nothing that you cannot figure out. There's nothing you cannot learn if you don't try hard enough. We also need to make sure that we don't get caught up in comparison culture. We live in a very social media-driven society, and especially with Twitter and the tech thought leaders that we see on Twitter, it can be really hard to not look at ourselves and say, well, I shouldn't even bother trying. I'm never going to be as good as that person. Oh, well, I'll never have the Stack Overflow score of John Skeet, so why should I even try? And these are real thoughts that we think about, and so that's something that we need to be very, very cognizant of when we're going to conferences, when we're following people on Twitter, when we're starring GitHub repos. Do not use that as a comparison for yourself. Because if you're too busy comparing and trying to be like somebody else, you're not going to bring your true value to the world. So don't get caught up with comparison culture. We need to remember that innovation comes from trying something new. We're never, ever going to innovate. We're never going to create new, great, amazing products and new things if we don't try first. Sometimes it's going to mean stumbling and falling, and we need to be okay with that. We need to learn to embrace failure as part of the process of trying. We need to understand that you will fail, and that's not condemning. That's not horrible. That is a learning experience. That is something for you to build on, and that is something you know that will not work in the future, and you will know not to make that mistake again. And you can't really talk about this without this quote by Grace Hopper. The most damaging phrase in the language is, "We've always done it this way." And it rings true today. If we are not constantly challenging the environment around us, whether that's code, whether that's the way we treat people, whether that's the way we understand other people's experiences, we're never going to grow and progress in the way we want to in society. So my call to action for all of you, after cocktails, is go try something new. Maybe ask a friend first if it's skydiving or something like that. But I really want you to try and break out of your box. Think about those things that you have been worried about trying or don't want to try, or maybe you have that pull request that's tucked away that you haven't been brave enough to actually submit yet because you think that people will see you as a failure. Go try something new. Go innovate, go inspire the world. Slides are available here. Sorry for the potato quality of the projector, if you can kind of screenshot that, but my handle is Tefedaiken, that's at the beginning of it. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, you wonderful human beings.